So this incredible building that we're in today, which has been kind of a foundation for me as an architect studying here in Bangalore. Every chance that I get, I would come and spend time here, and I know that's true for a lot of people who grew up. I don't know if it's true anymore, but it was true for us. And on a sort of personal note, it was also the first place I bought Sunitha, who's now my wife, for a very inexpensive but effective and successful date. And we're really fortunate to have Dr. Doshi here, who, of course, a lot of us have seen over the years in Bangalore, and we're so fortunate to have here. But this is an incredible building, and every time I visit, it offers up new secrets to me. Dr. Doshi is a fellow of the Royal Institute of British Architects, a fellow of the Indian Institute of Architects. He was born in Pune, and after initial study at the JJ School of Architecture in Bombay, he worked for 4 years with Leplastrier as senior designer in Paris, and 4 more years in India to supervise his projects in Ahmedabad. All those incredible seminal projects. And, we were very fortunate. My brother and I, Premjit, we made a film on Dr. Doshi a few years ago. And he would tell us of these stories where he would cycle to visit all of these 4 sites every day. A sort of very grueling but kind of fundamental experience for Dr. Doshi, taking care of these buildings that we now hold as treasures. He set up his office, Vastu Shilpa Consultants, in 1955. Apart from his international fame as an architect, Dr. Doshi is equally known as an educator and an institution builder. He's been the first founder-director of the School of Architecture in Ahmedabad, 1962 to 1972. First founder-director of the School of Planning in 1972 to 1979. He was the first founder-dean of Center of Environment Planning and Technology, 72 to 81. Founder-member of Visual Arts Center, Ahmedabad, and first founder-director of Kanoria Center of Arts, Ahmedabad. Dr. Doshi has been instrumental in establishing the nationally and internationally known research institute Vastu Shilpa Foundation for Studies and Research in Environmental Design. The institute has done pioneering work in low-cost housing and city planning. As an academician, Dr. Doshi has been visiting the US and Europe since 1958 and has held important chairs in American universities. I welcome Dr. Doshi. When we went to Australia in 2012, of course, Sandeep and I were really attracted because it was going to be the Glenn Merkin Masterclass. But the Masterclass has this incredible secret that we discovered when we went, and that's Richard Leplastrier, the incredible, incredible teacher. And a few of you have spent some time with him over the past few weeks, and I'm sure you'll carry that back with you as an incredible memory of this time here. Richard is a seminal figure in Australian architecture and architectural education. He eschews publicity, and his built works are secret treasures to be discovered only by those privileged enough to be introduced to them. His sensitivity to issues of culture and place and his accumulated wisdom in the design and making of architecture is gently revealed through his tutorial sessions in the design studio. He received national recognition in 1999 through the award of the Gold Medal of Royal Australian Institute of Architects. Richard has received international recognition through the receipt of the 2004 Spirit of Nature Wood Architecture Award. He's been awarded the Dreyer Foundation Prize of Honor 2009 in Denmark, the first time an architect from outside Denmark has received this prize. Thank you, Richard, for accepting our invitation, for being here with us today. And Peter, who was always the instigator at the masterclass, who's prepared some very, very tricky and kind of tough questions, will moderate the session. Peter, please.
I've known Richard for 40 years plus. And that was a yes. And originally as a teacher, and
then as a sort of mentor, I did some models, made some models, did some drawings for competitions, and then slowly as a friend. And it's been quite a journey. So if I was really to do this interview properly, my questions to Richard would be quite different to my questions to Dr. Doshi. But I've tried to arrange it so they're to a degree parallel. Dr. Doshi I only met at the beginning of the year at a conference. But as I think we mutually agreed today, it was a meeting that was probably going to happen at some stage. I think there's a friendship which is an honest and admirable friendship, and a understanding which is unspoken. So, and both these gentlemen are not only wonderful people, but they're great architects, and you're very lucky to be listening to them. My first question is just a very simple question, and it's really just to start the conversation. Both these fellows have worked for masters. Richard has worked for Jon Utzon, who did the Opera House and other great buildings of the world. One of my favourite architects, I think. He's also been taught by Masuda, Professor Masuda from Kyoto, Japan, who, although he didn't do many buildings, was a great teacher. And he's been taught drawing by Lloyd Rees, who's one of our great, if not our greatest, landscape artists. And he's also worked with Kenzo Tanigi in Tokyo. Dr. Doshi has worked with Corbusier. Everyone know Corbusier? And he's also worked with Louis Kahn. So my first question is, what lessons can you pass on to the audience? Some simple lessons you can pass on to the audience from what you learnt from those masters initially.
I think I learnt from Utzon many things, but two very basic things. The first one was that the landscape itself, without buildings, can be used as a spatial workshop off which you can spring to ideas in architecture. Not by copying nature, but just by taking the lessons that it shows us if we have the eyes and the mind and the spirit that is open to take them. The second thing, and I think possibly the greatest thing that I learned from Utzon, was his basic humanity. He was not interested in style. He was not interested in special form. He was interested in people and the making of places for people, the making of places of well-being. So if you take a seed and you put it in accepting ground, something will grow. In architecture, that seed is life itself. That's what I learned from it. Masuda, Japanese philosopher and architect. Very different kettle of fish. He was always interested in the thought that underpinned any sort of a building and art, the idea itself. That was the first thing. I hate to reduce it to only two things from him. But the second thing was he awakened us to the meaning of language. And the first lecture that he gave us was he wrote on a blackboard about 15 different characters for house in Japanese, and then he took the characters apart and showed us what made those characters up. And these are pictures of meaning. And so you saw the origin of house, dwelling, abode,
what about the story when you were having lunch at Annie Halford's place?
We had Masuda in Australia, and we took him to lunch at this house that I'd made when I was a really young fella. But it was a platform in the bush, a bit like some of Peter's things, but not as good. And we had this wonderful lunch, and Masuda kept looking outside to where this rough, wild bush was. And he turned to us and he said, "You must discover the rocks, the underlying land." And he leapt up and he grabbed a shovel and he grabbed a rake and he sprang out into the bush and he started to clear it and reveal this big boulder that was there. He was an amazing man. I loved him dearly.
And Lloyd Rees, the artist?
Lloyd Rees. Well, Lloyd Rees was a great drawer and a great painter and a great raconteur, but what he taught us was to love to draw.
Dr. Doshi?
Very difficult to follow Richard afterwards. What do I say? But anyway,
Plenty, I suspect.
Corbusier and Kahn, the relationship was a guru and a disciple. Hardly many people know. Kahn never met Corbusier, but he always considered him as guru. So when he died, Corbusier, and I passed his atelier and then went to Philadelphia to teach. I went to his room in the evening in his office. He was sitting there quietly, and I had called him from down below, so he knew I was coming. So the conversation was like this. He says, "Do you know?" I said, "I just came from Paris." He said, "For whom shall I work now?" All his life, he said, I worked and I always hoped that if he ever saw the magazines and if by chance there was my work, what would you think about me? And I think that kind of a relationship tells many things about devotion. Both these people were devoted. Devoted to not only their work, but the relationship to their gurus. And the other thing is, Corbusier wrote in one of his earlier things was that he did not know really that he was going to be a revolutionary or known or whatnot. It was not like that. But it was his work and his idea that he had to make a change for what he did. Kahn was more humble. You could hardly talk to Kahn. Nobody ever entered his house. Nobody knew. Because he would allow people to get dropped, the corner, crossroad, and he would walk to his house. Luckily, I was allowed to go and meet him. I knew his whole family. So both these people had a very different temperaments. But Kahn was only one who knew about Corbusier. He was very. The quality of Corbusier was, for example, only the major thing would be India. And what did he study? I never thought that somebody would study, climate everybody would study. But would anybody study? Because Corbusier always was writing in his diary, always sketches, writing dates. And if you look through his carnet, his diary, you find that he knew about Indian writing of Som, Mangal, Bhut, Guru, all the days, the month, the cosmic stars at that time. So I don't know whom he was talking, but he found everything in his diary and he wrote and he wanted to know the meaning behind this. Because he wanted to know really how people look at this. So miniatures, lifestyles, habits, All those things, he sketched. So when he came to India, for him it was a new world, completely different world. But he adopted and he went beyond the normal apparent conceit. He went into something which is inherent quality of it. In his early drawings and early books, you could see the Gopurans drawn. So it is not that he was not knowing things, but he was rediscovering them again in the context. Very organized, very, very precise. So painting was his another area that he was important. He was a friend of all those revolutionary painters. Picasso, Leger, Matisse. So all these things, are characteristics which talk about Corbusier's versatility and looking at things fresh. The one thing that he wrote to the students in 1970s, I found a letter addressed to the students. And he writes the first thing is, break all the rules. And I think it is very, very important. Because we make our own rules, we should break our rules. And I think that is a very important lesson. The other thing is, what is the essentials of things that will make things work? What are the ingredients which make things happen? And that's why he drew all the animals, birds, plants. Because he wants to know, or he was trying to know, I don't know, but one could guess from his drawings, that why there are so many characteristics of animals, forms, nature, birds, plants, and what is the essential character. And I think both of them, in their own way, looking for the essence of things that happen. And great reverence for history. Not because of imitation or anything, but what makes things last long, what makes things have a quality that's there. And of course, every architect knows about Corbusier's statement about light, form, space, volume, proportion. These are standards. But I think the discipline in which they work was very important.
You you mentioned the word versatility. Versatility.
Yes.
How do you see that playing out, versatility in an architect?
I think first, versatility could mean, do you go by one track or you go by many tracks simultaneously? Second, would you be able to find a crisis and make it into an opportunity? Is it possible to look at situations which are completely diverse, and can they be brought into something else which we have not noticed or seen? And I think that is that versatility, that always inventing out of a situation. So if there is apparent chaos, actually chaos doesn't happen. We think it's chaos. But the real situation, those who are there in the chaos, feel that these are the events. So the interpretation and the knowledge of knowing what it means is first to find out. Then, if you find that there are people dancing, somebody who sees from far away, he thinks that they are chaotic, they are drunk or something else is happening. But in reality, there is a festival happening. So these people, both of them, but especially Corbusier, would make that into a virtue and discover something out of this which he will use in his painting or in his drawing or in his work or in his making objects. And Kahn was more structured, but Corbusier was more flexible. And if you look at the work, if you give him this bottle, he would do something else that we had not anticipated. And I think that is what the ability was. So there are no difficulties, there are opportunities.
When would you consider that you both started to divert slightly from the teaching of the masters? Not divert in a bad way, but to do work that was not in line with the teachings that you'd had from your, well, you know, if you have multiple teachers, then you can't do multiple work. At some point in time, you're going to do work that is your own work. When did that start to happen with you two?
When did I break? Is that what you're asking?
I'm trying not to ask that.
Well, it's very difficult. I think the weight, you know, on the head is very, very heavy.
Yeah.
And if you are talking about a reference and cross-reference, and when you are breaking, actually, you know,
I think I'm talking more about a feeling.
Huh?
I think I'm talking more about a feeling than a date.
Yeah, it's very difficult to say when, but I was, when I left Corbusier, and it was, as I mentioned to you in the morning, I was born during the independence period. When I joined architecture, it was in 47. So, it was the first day, you know, big celebration happening in August, like this today, 60 years ago. And so when I went to Paris and I worked with him, I was still an Indian, because I had heard the Congress people in Pune, and I belonged to a place where the revolutionaries came, Tilak and others. So, I had some glimpses of this, and I was all the time talking about why should it be done like this. But when I saw the way he was working, I found that he was open-minded, and he wanted to break himself. And I think that was the most challenging thing, to break your own theories and start new theories, if I call theories. And then you discover something by which you say, oh, now I am getting the totally new. And for myself, when I did my first house, because when I left the office, I had taken a vow that I will not imitate my master. So, the question was, did I go away from it or not? So, the only way one can say is the moment you start reinterpreting things, and you question the same sentence, but look as a different image, and you create something else. And I think that is the time things began to happen. And then the school and the buildings, and as I worked, my office, I think, is the first building which I think broke away from all this, including both influences. But I'm scared inside. I'm still questioning whether I have freed myself or not. I don't know. I want to find out where I am going. I don't know.
Richard?
Difficult to say. Perhaps never. Because always those lessons stay with you.
Yes, fundamental lessons are there.
That's right. And then time and local circumstance is such a strong pressure in architecture, I think. Where we live, how we live, as against how, for example, the Danes live. We're different people, actually. So you take lessons initially, but when you start to work, I was going to say for yourself, but it's not the case. You're working for yourself, but on behalf of others. As that, I like to think education should be like that. That education should teach us to think for ourselves, but on behalf of others. So, I think for me, maybe local circumstances and being very closely tied to the building process, much more so than most architects, I would think. I mean, you and I are similar, Stutch. You know, we've both spent time on the building jobs. We both know how to use a set of tools. We both know how to make things. And of course, Utzon was a great constructor. But he didn't make things like we do. And I think that when you're confronted with the physicality of actually making something, then all your design drawings almost go out the window. things change. So for me, perhaps never to break. Certainly from Hudson, Tungay was different. Tungay was a great organizer, a man of incredible patience. He could outlast people in meetings. He understood how things worked from underneath. He had 15 people working in his office who were the best people in Japan. And he was able to make order out of chaos. That's his great strength as an architect. We worked on competitions, and we had 30 designs in model form in a big, this is for the High Court of Tokyo, in a big model that represented 1 square kilometre of the site, with just the site open in the middle and everything in there, every building in the place. And Tungay himself made 2 or 3 suggestions which were made in models. But it wasn't his one that finally went through. It was another one. And when we were working later on a set of drawings where it was incredibly tight time, one of the people in our office has a lot of trouble with the complex levels in a situation. And one night at 3 o'clock in the morning when we were working, as we did in the Japanese office, without a word, Tungay appears next to this man who was having the trouble. And Mr. Toki sprang up, and Tungay didn't say a word. He sat down, and in 15 minutes, he picked up the pencil, the scale, he changed it, overlaid the drawings, and made the answer there. He had a brilliant clarity of mind about those sorts of things, entirely different from Utson's. Utson drew, and you saw the building emerge under this heavy leaded pencil. Tungay got up from the drawing board and walked away, and Mr. Toki, who had been feeling very awkward because Tungay was a powerful man, had been leaning on the tracing paper with his hand, and only I saw it. He took his hand off the tracing paper, and the tracing paper had lifted through the moisture and heat of his hand in the perfect impact of his hand. Tungay was a powerful man, but one with incredible clarity of mind. Very different. I don't think I've ever been under this spell.
No, it is very difficult to say when you change your route, or do you find another destination or direction. But it is like flowing river. When is the river changing? Even though so many other rivulets come into it, your life, your experience is changing, and 1 kilometer to 20 kilometers, and before it reaches the mouth of the ocean, then doesn't even know the river, that whether the river has changed or the ocean has changed or things have changed. I think IIM was here because I did the IIM. Now, since we are sitting here, IIM Ahmedabad was done by Khan. I was involved from the very day one in even creating the program. So, until the last. It was his way of working. And his attitude to work, education, philosophy of education, the connections, of program, and then, of course, how does it manifest into building and creating these spaces. But for me, that was not what it is, because I thought that is his way of working as an academic. And my major was the Indian temple, the South Indian temple, where you don't know where you are going, and gradually you find your destination. Maybe not the same, but you say, oh, this is something I like. So I think when you walk onto the streets of India, you find lot of surprises as you go along. And some create imprints in your mind. And if you can get those, so the whole idea was, is it possible to create garden and informality and create surprises without even making them people know that this is for this. And I think the sense of the particular in which Khan was talking, a well-defined spaces, I tried to do here diffuse spaces here. So I think I was trying to do what I am as an Indian. They were both from outside. Of course, I was much younger with Corbusier, and neither I worked on a large project with him like that. They were specific buildings. But with Kahn, I did that, and so I knew that rigidity always bothered me, because Corbusier I always mentioned that, like our music, Corbusier was a musician who had orchestration and fluidity, but Kahn had a music which had very much rhythmic things. So the tonality, the kind of space, kind of work they would do was very different. And in India, the situation for me was something else beyond. And so I think this building represents something else, but I can't say that I have gone far away or found myself. It's very difficult.
And within that process, how do you see refinement and investigation playing a part, like refining your work and investigating?
Well,
how do you both see that as...
Corbusier and Kahn, there is a big difference. Corbusier was talking about playing things by chance. So he saw the Indian buildings and the brickwork and the kind of rough concrete and everything. He thought, why not create out of roughness grace? He was an artist first, architect next. And so he was really talking that way, that he said, I will change, I would use the roughness as a new quality of work. That's how this brutal concrete was. The word was invented. Or coined, I would say. The issue is, Kahn was always so precise that he had to have a certain way, certain standards, measures. And I found I was closer to Corbusier from that point of view, and not Kahn. Corbusier's buildings, all of them took chance. So on the way, it could even change. And by the time that you change, he has already used something else as a color, maybe added another element, created something else. In the assembly building in Chandigarh, the program, Corbusier would always purposefully avoid putting everything of the program on the drawing. Kahn would put everything on the plan, precisely. And Corbusier would then, when he starts doing his work, then something which is missing, then he will pick it up from somewhere and put it there exactly where he wants, and he would create a dynamic space. So one is a Hindu and one is like Islamic. One is talking about order, and other one is talking about the flexibility of order. How do you really create nuances into this? So it is almost like the music, where you are Indian music, where you chips, into this. As the Western music is written. So Kahn was like Western music, Corbusier was like Indian music. And that's why I call Corbusier an acrobat, because he was always playing a game. If we do something, if you say, for example, my friend was drawing on the board, the secretariat, and he wanted to go away after so many years of work. So he told me that maybe in 2 months I want to go and I'm going to talk to Corbusier. Corbusier heard this. So he was doing the plan and he was very sure that Corbusier would like to just show that this fellow doesn't know anything, my friend. He completely, radically changed the whole plan and showed him that there is still a lot to learn, you can't go. So it was his way of learning, teaching, doing things. But that shows the skill of a very fertile mind where rules don't work, situations work. And every day the water is flowing. So one day in the drawings, he is asking the Chandigarh engineer, we had gone to his cabana in the south of France. So he took out a pencil and drew 2 lines and he says, do you know the meaning of truth? Kant would define it very differently. Corbusier is now asking this question. And Mr. Verma said, I don't know, he was also a great philosopher, engineer, who selected Corbusier. I don't know Mr. Corbusier. So he says it flows between the two banks. It doesn't touch any bank. So he drew the two banks and the reverse, the truth was going like this. Now if you ask the same question to Corbusier, Kant, he would talk philosophically how truth has this. So there will be different kinds of attitudes. And so when you get these two attitudes, then I think the advantage that I had was that there could be a third attitude. And that's what I am trying to find. So the discovery is not whether I belong to this or this group, but I want to find out who am I. And I think that's where the effort is. And that's why every day you change and you try to find something new. In fact, this morning or when we were talking or when we came, the question was that we were coming from the old city and there were rickshaws and cycles and traffic jams and everything. But that is where I told you that but there is a tremendous vitality in this. One looks like that there is an apparent lack of organization or lack of order, but that vitality overtakes, the order that we talk about in a growing economy, changing economy. So in a culture which is constantly in flux, constantly expanding, and believe that the only constant is change, only certainty is uncertainty, I think we have to find out another way, which is our own approach. So that approach is that in this institute, which I worked almost close to 20 years, 4 directors changed. All the engineers changed. The board changed. I was the only constant. And then every director had a new program. So you make a building here, they say, no, but I don't like this place, you change there. Or no, maybe 100, 200 people is not good enough. This hall came after shifting 6 different locations. And it became 300 seats or 250 seats. So all these questions, you have to play the game by the time you are there. Because time changes, location changes, people change, finance changes, and the need changes. So what do you do in a situation like this? And I think then you can only think like Corbusier would say, oh, now it's a chance. So actually every change is an opportunity. So every crisis is an opportunity. And that's what I found. And that's what I think I learned the lesson. So if you talk about Tanguay and Woodson, I think Tanguay knew what to do in the end, but Woodson was searching something new. I think that's where they both are different. I think Woodson's freedom, Tanguay would never draw the curve that Woodson would draw. Never. He can never do this Sydney Opera House like this, which Tanguay would never do. Because one is, the Japanese culture would not allow him. So it's also the question of cultural nuances. No, even the slight change, shift of that curve is not so easy.
I designed boats.
Yes.
I understand. And Utzon understood because he came from a boat family and his father was a naval architect.
That's right.
Utzon was brought up in the shipyard. That's why he could make those solutions for the opera. But Tanguay, no, very different indeed.
No, like his sports complex is very different from this. So,
oh, you mean Tanguay Sports?
Yes.
Absolutely, but it was built by shipbuilders.
Yes.
And they informed the process. And Tanguay's drawings, that building was actually barely drawn from drawings. It started before the drawings were finished. That's the way the Japanese work.
Yes.
And it was put over to those masters in the shipyard. And then Kamiya-san from the office, who you may have met, he was responsible with Mr. Tsuboi. And that's where it came from.
You see, the Rosha Chapel, which is the most amazing building, and the fantastic kind of space and the power that it has. when it was in the model stage in the office, the roof was made curved, and Nervi happened to be there, Pierre Luigi Nervi. And they are sitting there in the atelier, so we were standing next to them. So Corbusier is asking, Mr. Nervi, this is the shell I am doing, and he is showing the seashell, the oyster shell, And he is saying, this is the roof I want to do. So Nervi is saying to Corbusier, Mr. Corbusier, you are an artist, you are not an engineer. I am the engineer. So don't use wrong words and don't conceive a curve is a shell. This is only a curved slab, not a shell. So that's how things happen. But still, he did something and he came out with a totally new way of doing things. So I think what you're talking about, the change and the variety or the dynamic qualities of discovery, comes because they want to achieve something which their heart talks about. I think there is another element besides brain is the heart, the throbbing of the heart. And I think all design comes from throbbing of the heart.
And the connection to the mind.
That's right. But mostly the last signal is from here.
The first gasp.
That's right. Indeed.
But refinement.
Did we answer your question at all?
Not really. But it's still good. What role does land play?
Huh?
What role does the land, play? We'll start with Richard.
It's for him. Yes.
What role does land play?
When I was young, it played very little. Hard to say. I can't really remember. But now I'm older, it plays almost everything. I've come to realize with the issues of the planet and many other things, and living in a country as we do, which is unbelievably beautiful, which when the white invaders came there 200 years ago, was like this magnificently organized garden, complete, right through the animal kingdom to the sort of sophisticated of an indigenous community for 50,000 years. Everything, that fine contract. And you remember, Stutch, you were sitting at the dining table in Lloyd Rees, the painter's room, with me and with him, and we were discussing the Aboriginal culture, and this wonderful painter who has a vision that goes through 10,000 years said, yes, they are an amazing people, he said, but we must never forget that it was this land that made them that way in the first place. Land makes people. Nature and culture are interlinked, but I think that land underpins everything for me. So as I've got older, I've come to appreciate that point.
But if you have in Australia population like in India, what would happen to the land?
Well, they wouldn't be there because we couldn't feed them.
Water
We couldn't.
them. Or water them.
We couldn't feed them nor water them.
Oh.
The edge of our country only almost can support life. And there's an interesting point with all of this, that there is such a uniqueness in that country, the way it is organized over time, completely different from any other place on earth, that if we introduced heavy fertilizers into agricultural development to feed another 15 or 20 million people, that brilliant uniqueness, which is not anywhere else on earth in terms of ecology, would disappear. So it's a really difficult, fine-tuned problem, that. The politicians don't understand anything about that, but the ecologists do. So I would say, in answer to that, we would welcome your brilliant culture. We would welcome that culture that we got wonderful Mahatma Gandhi.
Our rural areas always had a reverence for water, for the land and water. Slowly, it's all getting urbanized. And now we talk of land. If you say, what is the meaning of land? We say, what price it is available. That's how we have completely changed. And consequentially, our attitude to ecosystem, attitude to landscape, attitude to climate, and all the elements of nature, I think are not looked at all. And because of that, the nature of building here is becoming very different.
So, flowing on from that, you're both from very different cultures.
Yes.
Do you use culture as a reference?
Yes. I think I do. I do in a sense. I am trying to first understand. See, our culture, one can talk about it in terms of daily practice, daily reverences, understanding of life, but also culture philosophically, or when you really look at, read ancient systems of culture, epics, and then look back into what you are. But there are certain consistencies. There is still, I wonder, because we have so many diverse languages, so many different attitudes to food regionally. Costumes are different, tastes are different, cultures are different, language is different. So there is a diversity, but there is also something philosophically we are connected. We are almost the same in terms of compassion, in terms of reverence, in terms of sharing, in terms of what you can call being together, tolerance. All those things are fundamental here. But then when it comes to action, when it comes to doing something, it is not happening. So chaos happens because we tolerate everything. So it's reinterpreted in many ways. So it doesn't have any impact on our urban life or daily life. So everything is growing. As you saw in the old city, new city, there are no laws.
Richard, culture in Australia. How do you talk about culture in Australia and overlay it into a building?
Which culture are we talking about here? Are we talking about the culture that underpins us truly through its art, its stories, its crossing of the land through song, and developed over 50,000 years with 350 different languages because there were 350 different nations living in this one body of land? Very like India, but far more complex, even more complex. Are we talking about that culture, or are we talking about the culture that has come in fast, taken everything from the country that it could, and squeezed it to infinitely sort of nothingness almost, and a culture which follows money and status and possessions? Then Stutch, I don't follow that culture at all.
That's why I asked. Well, we'll describe, because it's describe how you'll come to interpret culture, as you have the way you live, the way you bring up children, the way you practice architecture.
That springs much more from the indigenous culture, I would think, but I would hate to be in a situation where I thought that I was in any way trivializing them or being token in any way. And really the only genuine work that I have done with the indigenous culture was with you in that marvellous building in Newcastle. But I think it has integrity and it has a belonging, long-term, big-time belonging in that culture, in that place. Whereas the smaller things that I've worked on have been much more in particular for the culture of the individuals for whom it was, with the exception of all the city work on Sydney Harbour, bringing land back into the public realm. But that's the thing about democracy. Not a situation, I don't think, about our culture. I think that's something about public land being public place and belonging to all. And this is the land on Sydney Harbour that was owned by the armed services, and that the government wanted to divide into housing and sell off and make much moolah. And we fought it, and we won, and we turned it over to the public. But it was a thing of democracy more than anything else, I think.
Also, culture needs rootedness. If you are constantly moving, the culture doesn't thrive, in a sense, because the culture begins with where you are, what the nature is of the place. Like the Kutch area in Gujarat, the area, the desert was there partly. I think that culture is still continuing, but now it is getting bombarded by all the development, and the development needs influence from outside. And whatever is being done, in the metros and other cities, you come back and implement there through industry, through other work. But those people who lived there for decades, we had a chance to work with them during earthquake. The first thing that I found, third, fourth day I went there, and you go to this place and you find, I asked to the woman, see, everything is collapsed, and you go there with your handkerchief, like a mask, and you walk, and I saw a lady there, and I asked her, I said, can you tell me what happened? So she was carrying a little bag, quietly walking. So she says, you don't ask me, why don't you go there into that lane? She directed. And there are children buried. Have a look at it. So you go there and you see those things happening. Then you meet somebody else. And then the other person says, go to this place and have a look at it. Then I met one gentleman. And then he said, you come. So he was a writer, but he was an engineer. So he said, why don't you come? Then he says, you come to my house. During devastation, things are in crisis, it's chaos. I go to his house, which is on the first floor, and the ground floor was there, cracked. I was scared to go up. But you still go up, and he spreads a little thing there, and he says, would you like to have tea? And then he said, in the last 10 days, I have burned 10 of my family members. He's telling the stories, still he has hospitality. And then we go after 1 month to do some work there. And we did this bunga with them. They completed that building on their own in 40 days without anybody's help, painted it, and they lived as if it was nothing had happened. During that fourth day, we went to see some people and we said, how about some help and all that? So they said, we do this, not this. That's the culture. And I think that is what I think pride of culture, pride of being somebody, and pride of saying that I can survive on my own. I think that is the sign of culture. That comes from that land. So you have that chance, in Australia, that you can still witness those things. And that is especially in the Aboriginal tribe. That when they know that, see, dependence robs you of culture. And that's the problem.
Frampton's saying that we're losing regionalism. Regionalism, and we're becoming more localised and internationalized.
I think that is where the confusion has started. Actually, I'm questioning myself. This morning I was questioning this, that what do we call in India when we see our own chaos? Is it something horrible? I mean, I can understand the dirt, the disease, the lack of control, and violence of rights, public rights, privacy and whatnot. But is this really otherwise Isn't it the wrong notion to give word to something by which we are meaning something else? I mean, international is something which is common to everybody. When you imitate somebody and somebody imitates somebody else and then it becomes one pattern, that is internationalism or what? So I think they all have come out of the pattern of economic capitalism, where you want to homogenize everything. And so if somebody has done work here in another culture, and when a historian doesn't understand, he says it is now a regional work. And then you go further and then you say, oh, this is local or this is something else. So I think history should not have these titles which actually freeze the notion of what it is. It may be talking about a particular region and therefore you are giving that name to identify that. But it may not be true either. In a changing society, in a diverse society. So, in terms of architecture, I think what is most appropriate for that situation, what you can call, you mentioned that about sustainability earlier, in your earlier statements, the kind of thing that you work with, looking at around, looking at sight, and you evolve, which is most important. I was asking Peter about, what about light in your photographs? I saw that the light outside and inside the house was the same. I saw houses, what I saw was almost ephemeral buildings, very simple, light buildings. Most of your buildings, except the last few ones, which are now enclosed or they have some other substance. I felt very light, very easy, very nice, very beautiful building. But there is a fragility to the building because it becomes a non-building. It doesn't have any weight. Now, but they did not give me an idea of how do you deal with your climate, how do you deal with dust, how do you deal with insects, how do you deal with other situations, in terms of day and night, what happens to the glare. Now, those issues are very different, which we are not talking, but in our culture, they were talked about it in a different way. Perhaps from your work, it is possible to look at and say, supposing that we were using this technology, not really the earth and all that, but all the things that you are talking about are produced, mass produced, the steel and metal and wood and everything else. So supposing that we talk, then the notion becomes completely different. What kind of a style would that be? Because you are now creating something totally different, even in Australia. So would that have anything to be talked? Suppose I remove the word Australia and I see these photographs. How would I judge them? What would I talk about? So my feeling is, answering your question about regionalism, there was some layering of characteristics of every particular region born out of their art, music, taste, color, pattern of living, and they were layers which were part of and parcel of the dwelling or the habitat. And so that is how really you saw that habitat. Even the notion of behavioral pattern, social customs, social conditions, and then climatic, they were all fused together, a courtyard, a ventilation system, or layers of walls for heat, or maybe the available material, maybe economy, maybe social fabric in which the families grow, etc. So these things were a part and parcel of a particular culture, versus what one is looking here today is those isolated buildings far away with large open spaces and very free like the tent-like structures, but done very gracefully in a contemporary way with what is available. So what would you title that? How would you call them? One is because it belongs to that place and it is rooted. So if you really look at that tree, you know it belongs to that place, etc. Similarly, you talk about architecture or you talk about lifestyle. In your case now, you are bringing something new. What is that? So would the word regionalism the appropriate. And isn't it the one which is conditioning us?
The question's for you, Stutch, really.
This is of course it is the interest to him.
Because, for example, my buildings aren't all like that. But there's a whole movement in our country where there is this incredible sort of lightness and evenness of light. I personally believe that you can't have light without darkness, and that one brings out the other, and that if you read Tanizaki's In Praise of Shadows, it's the most beautiful essay about that issue. But Glenn, for example, and many others have buildings which are unbelievably light. And I must say, personally, I find as my eyes get weaker that the glare is a problem, and that there's also a thing of retreat into a building, which you retreat into shadow. It's an animal quality. I mean, we're animals too, but it's an animal quality. And I think it's an interesting issue for us to all talk about in Australia, because the old farmhouses were actually quite dark inside, because the farmers were outside all day in a blinding light. I mean, the light in India is really strong, but the light in Australia is unbelievably hard. It's like hard like marble. And Egypt has a light like that. And the Egyptians learnt to paint in shadow on their buildings. They knew how to use it. I don't think we've come to modern architecture in our country. I think has slipped a little there. I think it's an interesting issue for us as Australian architects to pursue. And from the good Dr. Doshi, it's a good issue to raise, I think. What do you say?
In my defence, it's very hard to photograph the dark spaces.
I know. But you did show the first slide where you spent the night and early morning you saw the light. And I think that's what you admired also, and you spoke very highly about that.
But if I think of Bangaore, that's got a whole dark side which I didn't show. Like, if I think of Veranda House, which I showed, the whole section against the forest is dark. I mean, I don't think the buildings are exclusively dark at all, light at all.
But do we have to categorize styles? I'm going to coming back to the question.
But just to go on, a high percentage of our country is alive with light.
Yes.
Alive with light. Number one.
Even late evening, early morning?
Number one, it comes off the water where 90% of the people live. And number two, it's a horizontal landscape, not a vertical landscape. So the light travels quite generously across the land. I'd say there's a balance in the light in the buildings. A balance that's relative to the place. Anyway, what was your question?
My question was, supposing we remove these labels. When I teach sometimes in the school, I show a lot of photographs without giving the name of the place, the location, anything, and I said, now, here are these houses of all these kinds, or buildings of a type. Where could they be? And then you start judging them by looking at their wall and looking at thickness, looking at light, looking at people, looking at it. So you guess, it could be here, it could be there, it could be there. Now that was necessary maybe before technology was so advanced, but it is slowly advancing. But then, are we using that technology to homogenize everything? Or are we still giving some character to a particular place so that the joy of identity with that place is there?
Well, that was my question.
Oh.
That was my question, because what Frampton is saying is that the world is becoming a singular place in terms of architecture, and that the only architecture that's recognisable is a local architecture. as opposed to a regional architecture, which I
think this
if you look at the magazines, that's
this campus is really made for Bangalore.
yeah.
I mean, really, nowhere you will find a corridor with green space. Here you see green space all the time, everywhere. And I think that's what I thought, is the right thing to do here. And the shadows sometimes are very beautiful, sometimes there are no shadows, and the rains come any time. So I think it has been that's how the whole building was conceived, that let this become maybe a grand building, but modest feeling. You must feel that you are part of nature.
Well, we talk about that, Stutch, don't we? Like that a building, a great building, a work of architecture, there's a big difference. A work of architecture belongs to a place or in a place. And belong is a beautiful word, to belong.
Yeah.
This wonderful place here has that quality. And I think that we try hard to do that. Like we examine a place very carefully. We spend time in a place.
No, like your Miyake's house. It's a fantastic building, and I think it works in Japanese. It's a Japanese building. With the whole latchkey platform and the roof going like this and whatnot. So you have used the new technique, but you have still given them the local flavor in a sense. You feel that you are part of that culture. I don't think, building also has to do something with the nuances and inner callings, of people who are in that place, because they have rituals. They have rituals, they have their lifestyle, they have their connections with their festivals, then their social and religious customs. And I think those do reflect, somehow in buildings.
Is it about ethos?
Yes.
And that's a nice word too.
That's the ethos, yes.
And I think ethics belongs to that as well.
Do you have a relationship with your buildings?
Yes. Yes. Quite strong.
Can you explain that, please, Doctor?
Well, it's like a love affair, no? When you are in good mood, you like to go there, and go again and watch and wonder. I think it starts from the beginning when you begin a building. I think when you work on a drawing board, and maybe you have a client, but when the project is belonging to you and not the client, it is for a client. But when you are so much involved that you own it by your own virtue or your ego or whatever you call it, you are drawing it. And at that time, the sense of belonging begins to become better. And slowly, when you go, there's a dialogue between the drawing and you all the time. There's all the time going on. The client is now, he is an instrument, he is the cause of making this happen. Beyond that, I don't think the client comes into picture. Unless you are doing an industry, or unless you are doing a factory or something, or a multinational company says, you do nothing, you do give me this complete as package. It's not a pack. Building is not a wrapper. Building is an inner object. Building is something like something which is which you can touch, you can feel, you can in fact grab it and feel like as if you want to eat it. And I think that's to me a building is.
It's a subject, not an object.
Not only that, but it is something that you feel in your nerves, in your skin. So when that belongs to you, then I think you are giving what you know from inside to that. And it of course gives the thing that the client wants. The client's wants are measurable. But what you are doing is the unmeasurable part. And I think that unmeasurable part depends upon how much you have given, that much building belongs to you.
Richard, do you have a relation?
It's a love affair. It's a love affair. You put your heart and your soul into the making of not just something, it's a subject, not an object. And of course the people who it's for, so-called the client, but as we know, and we laugh very much about it, my old teacher, Professor Masuda, said, "I have always regarded the client as somewhat of the victim."
Yes. He is a victim.
And that's absolutely...
Actually, though, the art lies, in making the client feel that he really owns this, and we have given him this. I think, it's really architect, when he presents, it's like presenting your daughter to the, in-laws place. So, you know who owns what, I think, but still, it's a feeling that, oh, yes.
Dr. Doshi, you must be careful, the director of IM is here.
No, but so this is an offering. So okay.
Oh dear.
And just before we open it up to the audience, just before we open a few questions up to the audience,
Sure.
what has architecture taught you? What has architecture taught you?
What has architecture
Taught you.
Taught you? Taught me?
And Richard.
No, I think...
And Richard.
Yes.
Richard, what has architecture taught you?
Architecture, very simply, has really taught me to look at life.
Yeah. But also, I think it is not only that, but it has also taught me about myth. Myth.
Huh?
Because architecture in the end is a myth that you are creating. We call an architect Vishwakarma. Vishwakarma is, Vishwa is the word, universe. And he is the creator of the universe. And architect is the creator of the universe. That is what actually the whole notion is. Because when he thinks that, he has to take full responsibility of that. And when he is responsible, he gives himself totally. He dreams, he works, he does everything as if it is his own child, the real way. It is not a product. Then it becomes for him a process.
We're just going to have a few questions from the audience.
That's right. Fine. Thank you very much.
Well, I had a question. Yeah. Where are we going for dinner? No, this is a question for Richard and probably for Peter a bit. So we had gone to Australia over summer with our kids, and we were very fortunate to have time with both Peter and Richard. And we had time in Richard's house for a brief sort of maybe a couple of hours. And when we came back, my son was asking me, how come we don't live like that? Where you can see wallabies or look out onto the water and be engaged with the garden like that. So it's tough for me after coming back to India to reconcile with the way that we're living, with the way that we're practicing architecture. And I want to just know from you, Richard, what it takes and if it is a source of some despondency with what you see around you in the way that, a lot of us are living in our cities now, and how you think we can reconcile again with our world.
That's a really difficult question. And I really am not sure how to answer it because you have a lot of people in this country whose life is not so fortunate. And ideally, we would love to have a situation where everybody has a chance. And I think that architecture can play a great part in that. In the back of my mind, and knowing a little about Dr. Doshi's work, and we can have this conversation again a bit later, But I remember very clearly, I most clearly remember about a project that he has done where he made housing, and correct me if I'm wrong, he made housing for the people and didn't make the buildings but put in points of service where people had a right to clean water and clean waste disposal systems. And these points were put in, and then they were somehow, am I right or wrong?
Yes, yes.
Somehow allowed to build their own places around that situation. And I've always respected you so strongly for that. I think that's such a beautiful idea. So on one hand, it's possible to have that sort of insight as to how to help the people who are less fortunate. On the other hand, today, we had a great experience in the city. It was Independence Day, great day to be in town. And we went down the buzzing streets, and then we had a great breakfast and good coffee, and we got out, but somehow or other, in true Indian fashion, the bus had gone missing. And our good caretakers immediately took advantage of your most brilliant transport system. And we all piled ourselves, our son Ek and I, both with extremely long legs, into one of your little buzz cars. And we came back in what I can only describe to you as one of the most brilliant urban self-regulation systems I have ever seen. And for us, the lesson in that sort of thing comes from your culture. And traffic and people where there is density should just almost look after themselves. Sure, there's going to be difficulties, but traffic lights just don't work in this situation. You don't stop and start a system, you let it take care of itself. And as you try and cross the road, you catch the driver's eye, and he just goes, and you move. It's true, and our culture is bound up, locked feet, arms, with systems done by traffic engineers, where as an individual you try and walk along a city street like a right-angular robot. We are not like that. We're like a fluid. We move like ants move. So I'm not sure exactly, Bijoy, how to answer your question, but I think also with time it could be possible to have an architecture here for all the various levels that you have, which is very complex, which we don't have. We have a much more even system in our country, which has some advantages, but a lot of disadvantages. You have the light here. I think that your diversity is your greatest strength. It has its problems, but it's a great strength. I think it's possible, and I learnt this in Japan, it's possible to live in very tight situations as long as, one, you have reasonably clean air, good water, a waste system, a connection to nature, which in a city situation can be the sky. The sky is the free facade in the city. And today I took great pleasure from watching the clouds moving in the southwest monsoon wind, even when I was right in the middle of your town. I was watching the weather patterns. And those rain trees that cover the streets are simply magnificent. It's just a matter of just maybe
That's right.
tidying it up a little bit and just letting it take its course. Don't you think?
I agree with you.
There's a question. Zuala. Yeah, here.
If I may, and if you feel like answering, if the four of you, including Bijoy, were back to our age group, my age is very, very late 30s, almost into the 40s, what different thing would you have done? If you were back into your late 30s, what things would you have done differently from what you have done?
Here's a question for all of us. All of us. Yeah. Anybody who feels he's 30 can answer.
Well, I'll answer first because
Yes.
I'll be the briefest.
Yes.
I would have listened far more to my mother and my father.
I think we are very much now every day with computers, Facebook, Twitter, in emails. We are too occupied with our little machine. And even in the conversation, when there's a ring comes, so we are all busy. While we are talking, we are still doing this with our hands. As a result, if you notice, I don't know, but I noticed that I have forgotten a lot of numbers I used to remember. Addresses are gone. So my memory I am not using. I am not using my eyes. I am not using my ears. I am not using my feet. And I think the first thing I would say is it possible that in our daily life we don't use this phone or these gadgets for at least 1 hour, 2 hours, and go out and look at the stars and look at the trees, look at people and listen to things around.
I wanted to come back to your last word about myth. So, you're talking about myths. I just wanted to know all of these stories you're counting here. Where does it come from? Where all these stories come from? If you're inventing them or if you're taking them. If it's grounded from your...
Where are the stories that underpin some of the buildings, where the myth come from?
Good English, thank you.
Where do the myths come from, or the stories that you...
Actually, myths doesn't come from any story, it comes from your heart. It's verbs of your dreams. It's your imagination. You make your own myths. Actually, you are living, you can think, that I don't live here, and then it starts. Supposing, that you close your eyes, or you took, heavy drugs for 2 days, and you wake up, what would happen to you? You don't know what happened to those 2 days. So you have to go inside you. I think the myths would only come when you go deep inside you and lose yourself. Because then something else starts singing or speaking or creating in you a very unusual feeling. That's where creativity comes. That's how we wake up in the morning. And myth also, and myth and dream is hardly different. One is awake and one is asleep. One you cannot recollect, one you are making it, experiencing. And I think that's where myth comes from. You have to let go.
And the stories?
Stories you make.
How much do you take from your own country's culture when you reside in a foreign land?
We learn a language, and that language is universal. So if you learn to read patterns, you can read patterns in urban landscape, you can read patterns in landscape, you can read patterns in people. What you don't know is culture, and what you don't know is some forms of landscape. For instance, the Japanese job, it was a volcanic rock, and we don't have volcanic rock like that. But you could look and you could feel and you could see the way the thing was formed, and you could understand the way the trees were growing. So it's a basic language that's universal with specific punctuation that is local, and that's the thing that you translate. And I think, as Richard once said to me, the older you get, the easier that becomes. which is obvious, really. But being aware is a big thing. You can walk through a forest and not see anything. And you might have passed the most beautiful 3 different mosses on the ground for 3 different reasons. So being aware is very much part.
My question is to all three. With respect to things we touched upon today, with culture, with sensitivity to environment, what is your, I would say, words of caution or words of, or maybe lessons learned from the practices that we've seen throughout your life, which applies to this new drive which is happening right now of construction, which sounds like a very it doesn't seem like a very good thing happening. But what is your take and what is your comments or cautions for it?
With so much construction going on and with these ambitions to house everybody by a certain date, do you have any words of caution or do you have any lessons to offer for this kind of rapid construction boom that we're seeing everywhere in the world?
I just think we should slow down. First thing. I've seen it in China. We saw it coming into Bangaore. We looked out and we saw housing which was up to about 3 or 4 stories, and I could see some trees in there, and I can imagine that it's possible. That's quite a high density, actually, if these places are thoughtfully put together with little tiny courtyards, and it's possible to do it. But it's not possible for people to live well in these things which are going up to 40 chaotic stories with no connection to the ground. What about their kids? And their communication system is inside by lifts. And it's a question I always ask about high, tall buildings. How many good relationships do you know started in a lift? Not many. Only short ones. And so, unless we can rethink the whole thing about tall buildings and make it possible to interconnect floors so that, you know, the money people are making them like big layer cakes, like those sweet ones that we had in the dining room the other day. And the floors don't interconnect with one another. And they say, in our country, they say, oh, you can't interconnect them because of fire. Well, I think that's arguable. But if they had rules that said that the concrete in it was not to be a continuous engineering structure, that you could remove the center of floors between columns easily, and that's possible, then it's possible to interconnect floors in these taller buildings, and so you get a chance for spaces to interrelate to one another in a vertical system. I think that's important. And the second thing is, I think that the way the communication works in these buildings, it should work through community spaces and places. They may not stop, they may stop only at every 3rd level. And then the stairs that connect it are part of an interconnected social community arrangement, like, for example, shared laundry facilities. Maybe, if it were Japan, it would be shared bathing facilities. But places where food can be had, where resources can be shared amongst people. And community has a chance of starting in those situations. So, but not the way I saw it going, and Stutch and I saw it going coming into Bangalore. You know the areas that I mean on the way back from the airport. That can't work. And that will just make the most horrendous long-term problems, I believe. About density. If you have 5 floors up and they're tight, quite tight arrangements, and you can be in the street and you can see someone at an open window, windows must open. Try and find a hotel in our city where the window's open. It's difficult. but the windows must open, you should be able to see, like, the colour of the shirt that your friend's wearing who's going to come down and meet you in 5 minutes' time. And you should also be able to say, come on, you're late. Those connections are fundamental to communities in dense situations. So my thinking, anyway, and I'm naive about these things because I don't get involved in that stuff, and maybe I should, but it's the intercommunication of people and their coming together and their sharing of things that's important in dense living.
Personally think the answer is really obvious. I think that we shouldn't be building that sort of housing. I just think it's not good socially. The only person that benefits is the developer. Really. And so why do we do it? It would be possible for a developer to still make money with really good design at 5 or 6 levels, but not amazing money. You know? And we as architects have lost the will to fight. It has started here and it's down here.